This is Nick and Sarah from Jackson Regenerational Farm.
Hi there.
We're here today to talk to you about starting your first no-till regenerative garden. You may have gardened before. You may be new to gardening. You may be wanting to change the way you're doing things. Maybe you've had success. Maybe you're having limited success after a few years of tilling. I want to just start out by saying I always aspired to become a master gardener. I never actually got there. We are always growing and learning, and we have a lot of experience gardening. We've had a lot of successes and a lot of failures, and we have a growth mentality, and we just want to keep learning. But as we learn, we also want to try to do things in a way that increases the life in our garden soil. Not only in our garden soil, but if we're sourcing material from elsewhere, we want to know that it's being ethically sourced, or we're looking to minimize inputting things into our garden, because conventional gardening at this point is mostly a lot of inputs, and tillage, and whether you're turning the soil over by hand or you're using a rototiller or a tractor, all of those things have an effect on your soil, as well as an effect on wherever the rototiller and that fuel for the rototiller is coming from. And there's lots of reasons to not use those things. So, Sarah, what we were just talking about the 6
Tenets of soil health.
Yeah, this is from Gabe Brown's book.
Dirt to Soil.
Yep. So, what were those again?
I don't know them in order specifically, but the way that we remember them is minimal disturbance of the soil, which means if you till, you can minimize that. If you're used to tilling quite often, you could minimize that down. If you're, tilling because of weeds, we're going to talk about that in a second. But there's other ways that you can minimize the soil disturbance. And in my studies and what I've read is that some people have done studies where they have disturbed soil, broad forked even, just minimally disturbed it, and no disturbed soil, and grown potatoes side by side, and the potatoes with minimal disturbance did much better, higher yields than even broad forking. So this is just important to think of.
That's sort of an anecdotal. I mean, you could have better yields in lots of different ways. So it really depends on your context, which is another soil health principle, is knowing your context.
For 1 second, to get back to the minimal disturbance, we think of the soil around us, the soil that we're standing on, as a community of things that work together. And so when we choose to impact it in a certain way, we might be altering the community below our feet in a way that isn't healthy for them. So as far as minimal disturbance goes, we do our best we haven't tilled in years.
We sold the rototiller
A couple years ago. Yeah. So the second tenet is to keep the soil covered. And you can do this with a couple of things. You can do it with mulches. You can do it by planting cover crops, which then can compress down into mulches. Certain mulches like compost is a mulch, can be a mulch. Wood chips, hay, leaves.
There are things that you may want to consider with some mulches. Some mulches like straw could come with herbicides, which may affect the way your plants will grow. Some hay, commercially grown hay that you might buy at the hardware store or the farm supply store, those that may have herbicides on it.
And the persistent herbicides are typically for hayfields to get the broadleaf plants like dandelions out, so they would affect your broadleafed plants in your garden, like your tomatoes, potatoes.
Yeah. Other mulches that you may want to just be careful with are sawdusts. It's just a little bit too much carbon, not enough nitrogen. It's going to be really slow to break down, and sawdust is probably fine for your paths, but you'd want to keep it away from your plants. Some people use wood chips right around their plants. Some people think that that's again too much wood, and wood chips are great in your paths.
That's what we choose to do. We choose to keep hay and compost around our plants and wood chips in the paths.
And as the wood chips break down, you can rake them onto your beds, and get that more longer lasting carbon into your garden beds. So we got minimal tillage, armor on the soil, context,
living root.
Keeping a living root in the soil. It's sort of a tricky one to do in the garden. It's more or less like don't be afraid of weeds. Weeds can be your friend. They are your friend. They're telling you things about your garden. You may want to. The other ways of keeping a living root in the soil is to plant companion plants, to cover crop when your season is over and you have a bunch of bare soil, and you don't have enough mulch around. You could get some cover crop seeds. It could be oats, clover, other grains, barley, wheat.
Yeah, and if you're used to, maybe you've tilled in the past and you have used conventional fertilizers, and now there's a fertilizer shortage and you're wondering what to do this year. Nick was finding out the information. How much nitrogen is around us in the air everywhere?
It's 78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen.
78% of our atmosphere is nitrogen. So there is plenty of nitrogen around.
The trick is getting it from the air into your soil.
Right. And you can do that
with nitrogen fixing plants.
Right.
So clover, beans,
legumes, peas, even some certain trees and black locust, honey locusts, those bean trees.
Those may be inappropriate for the context of the garden,
right.
but there are people out there who are actually doing what they call silva arable, where they are keeping trees in and around their garden and maybe pollarding them, keeping them short so they make less shadow, and letting their roots sequester that nitrogen from the atmosphere, as well as build carbon in the soil. And we do have a black locust tree just right over there. It's not really part of the garden yet, but I think
there's some perennials around it. Yeah.
Eventually the garden will probably migrate around it.
Another thing about keeping a living root in the soil is there is so much biological activity, and especially here in New England, we're covered. Our land is covered in bedrock, so we've got minerals everywhere as long as we let the plants and the plant community, the soil community around it, mine it for us.
That's the microbes and the fungi, and and that's the other part about keeping a living root in the soil, is that the root, the living plant secretes exudates from the plant, which are, you could call, liquid carbon, and that liquid carbon feeds the soil organisms, the bacteria and the fungi, and the plant, through the specific exudates that it's secreting, will tell the plant, the soil community, what minerals it needs, and those fungi and bacteria will go out and get those minerals.
So we like to have a saying here on the farm, and is we have everything we need to do the things we need to do, and we believe that of our garden as well, of our plants that are growing, and that if there's a weed, a forb that pops up, it is there doing an action. If nothing else, it is bringing in sugars into the soil to feed the microbes, and if you don't want it there, you can just cut it off at the top, leave the root in the soil, and take the leaves. But a lot of the plants...
Or just what people used to refer to as chop and drop. You just leave it right there and let it decompose in place.
That becomes a mulch.
And then we often we just mulch right over the weeds.
That's right.
We may not even cut them down. We might just lay down a thick layer of hay or wood chips right over the weeds.
I'll take you on a little adventure in a few minutes, and we'll go look under some hay that I laid about 2 weeks ago. I rolled it out. The grass was starting to come up. The pasture, we're extending the garden out this year, and I rolled out some more hay, and we'll take a peek in there and see what activity is happening. And I think there's a lot. It's Olin's favorite job to peek inside and see what kind of worms and bugs are growing in there. But so that was leaving a living root in the soil. And then the next one...
So just from the top again, so we can remember these. The first one was minimal tillage, armor on the soil, context, living root.
And the next one is animal impact.
Animal impact.
Which is kind of what we were just talking about with the worms. Because worms are a form of animal impact. So most people on a home scale, they're like, well, I can't have sheep on my yard, or I can't have chickens. If you can't have chickens and you're living in the city, but you're farming and gardening, how can you have animal impact on your farm?
Well, in that video we were just watching, which maybe you can share with the viewers, he was talking about planting sunflowers, like interplanting sunflowers throughout the garden to encourage bees to come. That's some animal impact. To encourage birds who will come and sit on the sunflowers, and they will be there to eat pests. They will leave their droppings.
Yeah, so how do we do, we live on a farm, we raise sheep, we raise chickens, we have the potential to, some years we bring the sheep in and let them graze the garden, we have an animal impact that way, but how do you do it on a smaller scale?
And having chickens, at your home would be, if you do have chickens, getting some electric netting, and when the gardening season is over, but putting your chickens to work in the garden to scratch around. I've heard of one guy in Bangor, I believe it was Bangor, which is funny because Bangor doesn't technically allow chickens, but he told me that he had chickens on his garden beds, his raised beds. He kept chickens on, rotated the raised beds. So he had his chickens on one raised bed while he was growing things on his other raised beds, and then he'd, as the season moved on, he would move the chickens over and replant where they were. So that's sort of like a really small scale version of how you can have some smaller livestock on your even, suburban raised bed gardens.
Yeah, absolutely. So animal impact, definitely think about how you can incorporate different sized trellises, sunflowers, flowers, which leads us into our next one, which is, plant varieties, diversity, where you're not planting monocrops. Now, many people who have home gardens aren't planting monocrops, but you can even do this within a single bed. If you're doing carrots, you're planting in flowers within them so that you've got variety. Or like you said, the video will link below, where he was planting sunflowers.
Companion planting in different ways. You can plant radishes with your carrots. It'll help spread your carrot seeds out. You can plant. There's the Three Sisters method of planting corns, beans, and squash. It's one way to kind of hedge your bets. Like if one crop fails, you may get the other crop. They may support each other and be symbiotic. If you're planting nitrogen fixer with a non-nitrogen fixer like beans and corn, the beans will help draw down nitrogen for the corn. You plant the squash down low, a bush style squash that will, or a vining squash that will kind of create shade and mulch out, shade out the weeds.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's the six tenets of soil health that we also believe in, and we have been working in our garden, and we wanted to make sure that we share some of this information. I guess we don't really believe you should be doing anything or you shouldn't be doing anything. We want to support you if you want to grow with us and learn. I have taken this garden in 1 year. I came out here in April a couple years ago and rolled out some hay, and was able to plant by the next month. So it's April now. If you're in Maine or another northern location, you can have a garden within a month if you are able to roll out hay. The other thing we like about this method is we watched some Ruth Stout videos a few years ago, and they talk about, she talks about.
Yeah, check out Ruth Stout.
Yeah, you can look her up on YouTube. She's fabulous, load of wisdom. She talked about how, she was elderly. She wasn't able to necessarily come out and do as much as she was when she started farming, started gardening, which was in her 50s, I believe. And she didn't need to do much. She would move the hay away, she would sprinkle some seeds, and she would go away. She wouldn't even water them in, and how that helped her grow all her own food, and she still did all her own canning and everything.
That does remind me that we don't water our garden.
Right.
We may water seedlings in when we first put them in, but last year we planted a whole bunch of onions, like I don't remember how many, a couple rows. It was a few hundred onions probably, and didn't water a single one.
And this was in the dry spring of last year.
Because we had been gardening in this way for a few seasons and been building carbon in the soil, the soil was moist, and we didn't feel like we needed to. We didn't want to take the time to, and we were interested in what would happen if we didn't water these onions in.
Right.
And they grew fine.
It may not work in your context, but in our context...
If you have really well-drained soil, like sandy soils, and you haven't been building carbon, then it may not...
Right.
Watering may be necessary.
In our context, it worked last year, and we were able to grow amazing onions. And we didn't water the garden once. Again, Maine was in a drought last year. For 3 years, we've been in a drought. And, we like to push the edges of what's possible, because there may come a time when, not only is there no rainwater, but there's no running water. And so what happens when people can't grow food and have access to running water and gardens by streams, and you don't have the ability? Sunlight is important. We do believe in having sunlight on your garden, so, but water is one of those things that is questionable. Do you need it? Do you not? Is it something that you have to carry heavy buckets of water and water things in?
Another thing I just thought of, to skip back to the topic of mulches. We've done it, and I kind of want to discourage it. We won't do it any longer. Again, the concept of using plastic as mulch.
We did it one season.
Well, we've done it even more than that. Like in the past, when I had brought home all those big pieces of plastic from Vermont Compost that we're basically trying to use some trash from Vermont Compost when we were in Vermont. Big pieces of plastic from the peat moss packaging.
Yeah.
We had covered beds in the garden. And then in Belmont, we've rolled out a big piece of plastic to cover half the garden. And it became such a mess to get up.
It's an interesting thought to buy plastic to cover the ground, to suppress the weeds, because you're afraid of weeds.
Right. And where does the plastic come from? What's the
Right.
environmental impact of the creation of that plastic? Where is it going to go when you're done using it?
Right.
That brings up the whole concept of landfills and landfilling and
Right. And it's the same, I think, with watering systems, with poly tape that
so much of it's just disposable.
Single use, single season use.
And then on the more personal level, it's like those things all off gas, and it's not just the gas, but it's the phthalates and the estrogen,
Right.
The endocrine disruptors that are coming out of those toxic materials.
Right.
It may be at a really minor amount, but
we don't know the impact.
We don't know what effect it plays on our health, and maybe it's minor on the you do it once or you do it for a year or two, like it might not really affect you. But if we continue doing it as a culture for generations, we don't have any idea what kind of impact that's going to have on us or on our children or our children's children. So it's just probably best. We feel like it's best to keep the plastics out of the garden as much as possible.
And I think that we've come to the point where we realize they are not needed.
Not needed.
In our journey of learning, I can speak for myself and Nick. We both didn't grow up gardening or farming. My grandmother gardened, but I didn't learn a lot from her because she died when I was young. And so, all of these things that we've learned, we've asked questions and we've figured out, and what does this person do? And when a lot of people are afraid of weeds, a dandelion going to seed, or a what's the one?
Lamb's quarter.
Lamb's quarter. Somebody came to our farm and was like, "Did you know that those seeds can live for 7 years and you'll have?" And I was like, "I'm not worried about lamb's quarter at all."
What we're trying to do here is increase the health of our soil, and we believe that in truly healthy soil, weed seeds won't even germinate. you can have weed seeds in the garden, and if you're not tilling them up, bringing them to the surface, they don't get the sunlight, they don't germinate. If you increase the conductivity and the pH to get the pH where it's good for growing vegetables, some of those weeds really prefer to have disturbed, messed up soils, and if your soil's healthy and improving on an annual basis, we believe you're going to see less weeds. And not only will you see less weeds, but you'll see less pests.
We'll link to the video about pests not being able to see healthy plants, given by a doctor down in Florida. But it's fascinating to me because
it's just like anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Pests, insects go after weak prey. They're going after the weak plants. So if you're having a problem in your garden with insects that are eating your plants, you have a soil health issue.
And it's the same with fungal, in my opinion, with blights and things like that. You have a soil health issue. We have not, and we do not use any
pesticides, herbicides, fungicides.
Even organic approved. We do not believe in them. They do have an impact on, even organic approved, have an impact
they're going to have unintended consequences.
That's right. What they're killing, who they're killing, how they're choosing to kill it. And it's the same thing with the tillage. We would rather build soil, focus on the positive, building the soil, increasing the life on the farm, and using those other things that are popping up as signs to increase, how do we manage it? How do we go from there? So we hope this isn't too long. Thanks for hanging out with us. And please ask any questions down below in the comments and we will get to you.
Smash that like button.
And subscribe. And please ask any questions down below. We'll be doing another video, a follow-up gardening video with any comments that you guys have come out with, and as the season goes. So I'm gonna go take a look at underneath this hay over here, and I'm gonna let Nick get back to work.
I'm gonna go carry buckets of water today to the animals. just today.
Just today. 10 buckets of water. You got this.
Yep. All right.
See you later. Bye-bye. Okay, so here's some hay that we rolled out a few weeks ago. I forget how long exactly, but I believe that everything was kind of green under here, and you can see it's very fungal and it's grow, and you can see that underneath here is just this amazing kind of gross looking community. Oh, here's a green plant. So you see it's turning yellow. It hasn't had any sunlight and it's just being suppressed. It wants to grow, but it can't get through. It has no sunlight. And so we're just turning all of this grasses, becomes food for the worms. And you see all these holes? Do you see all these holes? Those are worm holes and bug holes. There's a dandelion. And I'll pull this back, it's kind of tough. It's kind of matted down. But really, you can get, and then when you're ready to plant, there's a nice worm. Look at that beautiful thing. The amount of wormholes in an area is really fun to count if you ever have a chance to do that too. You can really see what kind of life is in the soils. I just pulled the top off of that dandelion. They're kind of just falling apart because the worms are eating them. Little worms everywhere. Here's another one. Doing their work. Oh, we're going to cover this back up again, but these little clumps of soil, you see those little balls? That's really important. Now, yeah, last year somebody asked me, what do I do for slugs and snails? And I said, I don't have a problem with them. They don't attack my plants. I have them in the garden, but they don't attack my plants. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think that the reason is because I give them so much food to eat. Like, I'm giving them a lot of decomposing material, and they'd rather eat the decomposing material than having to come up onto my plants and eat those. So these are some of the hay bales that we rolled out, round bales that we rolled out for our context. And yeah, hopefully we'll keep continuing to grow the garden and make it a place where you can come and visit and see how we raise food. But see here between the hay bales where the grasses are growing, you know, it's green right here because it's not being suppressed. That doesn't really bother me. I will come in with some more hay or some wood chips or just let it grow. And, you know, depending on what plants I am planting here, it may not affect me. This is a living root in the soil, though. It is doing work. We may not think of it as food, but it is food for the soil. So really, really, really important. And I did put my chicken fence up. I know you guys were wondering, because they love getting in the garden. So I had to put my chicken fence up, and that usually keeps them out as they're running away right now.